And you can know you're becoming frustrated in that classroom. You can feel your toes curling. You can feel your grip on your pen getting tighter. But if you're not able to regulate and shift that emotion, then you're still going to react.
You're listening to Around the School Table, hosted by me, Steve Davis, and proudly powered by Zuno Suite. We'll be bringing together the many voices shaping primary and secondary education across Australia, from principals and teachers to education thought leaders and system innovators. Whether you're in the classroom, the staff room, or the boardroom, this is your podcast to be informed, inspired, and connected. Today on Around the School Table, we're joined by Dylan Sulzer, founder of Not Just Teacher Education, whose unique journey from Port Lincoln to the Northern Territory and even mustering cattle along the way has shaped his deep understanding of emotional intelligence in education. Dylan brings practical tools and insights that help teachers and students navigate tricky behaviour, build emotional regulation, and foster a positive classroom culture. From reframing defiance as a bid for independence to exploring the balance between happiness and purpose, Dylan's approach offers educators a fresh way to connect, support and empower young people both inside and outside the classroom. I'm pretty confident this conversation is going to bring a bit of warmth, a bit of wisdom, maybe even a dash of humour. Dylan, welcome to Around the School Table.
Thanks, Steve. It's really great to be here.
Now, Dylan, you were born in Port Lincoln. You spent your formative years, though, in the Northern Territory, even mustered cattle. That is an unusual journey into education. Can you share us how those early experiences shaped your understanding of human behaviour and how it ultimately got you to the field of emotional intelligence?
Yeah, so look, it's one of the things that I am very grateful for growing up in the kind of setting that I did. And as far as childhoods go, I was very fortunate to experience a lot of, interactions and experiences that the typical child living in a city setting doesn't actually get to experience. So my dad was a manager in a national bank, Westpac at the time, so we got to travel a lot, and a part of that was actually going out and living in some rural and remote places. So a lot of the majority of my childhood was spent in Katherine, which is about 3 hours south of Darwin, and what that did was it opened my eyes to a wide range of different demographics. And being able to just be present in the moment, because you don't have all the opportunities like going to the movies or everything right at your doorstep. So what happened was we kind of got to enjoy each other's company and actually do things like you said, like mustering cattle. So my school holidays were going out and spending it on the land with a number of station owners, and they taught, how to muster cattle. I went landing on planes on highways with one wheel, which for me, as someone who's scared of heights, was quite an experience. So I guess what it did was I got to see a wide range of what the world offers, not just in experiences, but also in types of people from a really young age. And I was able to and looking back on that, at the time, I didn't really know what was happening, but that's given me the opportunity to actually develop empathy, a really strong sense of empathy, because I've been able to experience all these different people along the way and along my journey. And then eventually moving over to Brisbane, where I'm now based, and have been for the last 20 odd years.
I spent a fair bit of time in the Northern Territory, and I think I understand why they have a slight head start in emotional intelligence and empathy, because I was waiting for a woman to turn up to one of my marketing workshops in Katherine. She had a mango farm and a small laneway that gets you out of the property, and a python had swallowed some sort of animal and was laying across her pathway, blocking her exit, and so she just had to wait, and all the other Katherinites in the class, they understood. They just waited, and life went on. There's got to be something about that mindset that would be different to what would happen if someone in Sydney was being held up like that.
Oh, 100%. And that's the thing. Like, I remember vividly, like going to school, we used to ride our bikes to school, and there would be blue tongues that just used to kind of set up and sun themselves on the footpath. So you kind of had to wait and give them their time to kind of move. Or, we'd have, wallabies and animals coming up to the front yard and actually, sleeping or finding shelter under the verandas. And it was very much you kind of have a pace that's, you have a slower pace of life. And you're very much accepting of that things aren't always going to go to plan. And I think that's a really big one, is that no one's put on this earth as to be a bad person. We get influenced in certain ways that cause our decisions to lead down a certain path, but looking for the good in everyone, because no one's there to actually come out and make your day typically bad. So I think that mindset's a really important mindset to take in. And something that I do quite a lot with clients who I work with is it's about zooming in and zooming out. So zooming into what that other person might be experiencing or feeling before you actually act yourself. And that gives you that perspective of where they might be, what they might have experienced 30 minutes before coming and seeing you, or what they have in their emotional backpack that they've been carrying around for years and years that have led them to actually behaving in that way. And then once you do that zoom in, you can then zoom out to actually now go, okay, what am I trying to get out of this experience, or what is the desired outcome here? And then that helps you kind of frame the way that you actually go about your response.
That is a great overview, and I'd like us to start zooming in a little bit, but let's do it historically, because, Aristotle talked about emotional regulation, a long time ago, but it was Dan Goldman who brought emotional intelligence into our lexicon. I think it was as recent as about 1995 or thereabouts. And in emotional intelligence, there are 5 parts. One of them is related to regulation, which is going to be a key part of our chat today. But can you give us a bit of a tour, a guided tour through the 5 parts of emotional intelligence?
You're right in saying that it became very mainstream in 1995 when Daniel Goleman released a best-selling book around it. And it's broken down into those 5 domains. So he broke them down into self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and what he called social communication. Whereas I've kind of changed that a little bit when I talk about the communication side of thing, and I use relational communication, because essentially what we're trying to do in the way that we communicate with others, we're actually trying to build a positive relationship. So you can communicate in a way that will break down relationships by the words you use or the demeanour in which you approach the conversation, but being emotionally intelligent is all about building a positive relationship or adding value to that person once you leave that interaction. So the starting point of all is really, well, before we actually get to those, a lot of people have a misconception, I guess, of what emotional intelligence is. Mm-hmm. They often think it's a personality trait when really it's a skill set, and it kind of shapes how we understand ourselves, how we connect with others and navigate challenges. So that's essentially the crux of it. And then the second misconception is people typically think emotional intelligence is just being nice, but where it's about actually being aware. And it's aware of yourself first, and then aware of others second. So you're using the data of your emotions or the information your emotions give you, and being able to interpret accurately what response is going to align with your values. And that's why I believe it's the foundation and sits at the centre of all well-being, all performance and all leadership, because it's really the starting point, because it's what's internal to you, and that's where we begin with self-awareness. And that's essentially, I tell people, we ask the question, what am I feeling and why? So it's the ability to kind of recognise emotions as they happen and understand why they're influencing your thoughts and behaviour. So what that is a teacher who recognises that their toes are curling, they're holding their pencil a lot tighter in the classroom. That's showing that they're actually beginning to become frustrated. And by being able to sense that emotion before it actually happens and react to the disruptive class in front of them, they can do something about that and regulate that behaviour by, doing a regulation technique like pausing or breathing or giving themselves space. And then what that does is that creates some space, because if we're feeling attacked as a person, in let's say in a physical form, someone's attacking us, we try and move away to give ourselves space. So what we need to be doing is giving our brain the same space to be able to make those decisions. And what that does is when we're self-aware and we're able to see those emotions coming before they actually hit and we're reactive rather than proactive, it allows us to look at all the situations in front of us with curiosity, and actually underpin what is happening so we can control the situation instead of reacting. And there's research out there that shows that, that people with that higher self-awareness do demonstrate those stronger leadership skills, they're effective with decision-making, and they do have a higher well-being. So you think of people who maybe, for the listeners, who they have worked with or someone that they aspire to seeing or being like, and they've had maybe a great principal or a great leader or a great mentor in their workplace. Typically, those people have a really good awareness of themselves and understand that that's what I need is what I'm feeling. I'm not going to show that overtly to start with. I'm going to assess what I'm feeling, and then I'm going to approach the situation appropriately. So that's essentially self-awareness is that foundational point, and then that leads us into the self-regulation. So they go really hand in hand. So you can be self-aware and you can know you're becoming frustrated in that classroom. You can feel your toes curling. You can feel your grip on your pen getting tighter. But if you're not able to regulate and shift that emotion, then you're still going to react. So it's kind of almost like a symbiotic relationship. So self-regulation is that second domain where it's looking at managing the pause. So having that moment and creating that space so that you are able to actually respond in an effective and controlled manner. So the core question that you kind of asked there is, how do I just respond to what I feel? And that's the ability to manage emotional impulses and to maintain that control under stress. Because when we are unregulated, it is generally a stress or our cortisol levels rise. And what we're doing is we're not trying to suppress the emotion, we're just delaying it. So we're actually giving us space to be able to then approach it. Because what will happen is in our brains, if we look at it from a neurological kind of side, is our amygdala, when we feel threatened in any way, we go into that fight, flight, freeze mentality. So what happens is our limbic system fires up and our amygdala, which is that tiny little peanut-shaped part of our brain, and it's one of the most primitive parts of our brain because it's how we wanted to survive right back millions of years ago. And when that fires, it actually switches off our prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is what I call our thinking brain, and it's what actually allows us to apply logic and to make decisions. So when that actually switches off, we react in a way that might be impulsive, and that's where impulsive behaviours come. And when we work with children or young people, their prefrontal cortex isn't actually developed until their mid-20s. So what they're doing is they're actually running at a deficit to begin with. So that's why we see a lot of children, young people and children, especially when they're feeling vulnerable, act impulsively or do things that are out of character, because that's what they're lacking, that ability to self-regulate.
And Dylan, if I can understand this correctly, when you said part of the challenge here is to manage the delay in your response, I remember in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey talking about if there's something challenging coming up, it's got to be a tough conversation or you react in an emotional way, diarise that, put it in your calendar for a little bit later, because I guess things cool off, and then when you come to it, I guess your prefrontal part of the brain is going to have more chance of being engaged. Is that the dynamic?
Yeah, 100%. So it's about giving your brain time to breathe and to allow the prefrontal cortex to switch back on. So a really simple way, and diarising and walking away and actually writing down that emotion is a great strategy to use. One thing that people do say is, hey, that's not practical. And one thing that I like to do is making all of this really practical for anyone to be able to actually use day to day and in the moment. So being in the moment, it's very hard once that prefrontal cortex switches off to actually pull yourself out of that and not let those emotions take over. So a really simple one, if diarising is not something that's possible at the time, taking 2 really deep breaths, and you can kind of do this in a way that's not, the big chest lift and the big sigh afterwards, but just through the nose, hold it, and then release. Typically, you can do 4 to 6 seconds of a hold. And then what you do is you actually find, or you choose a topic or a category in your space to name. So, for example, if you're in the classroom, 2 big deep breaths, you go 1, 2, and then you go, I'm going to name 3 things that are blue. And what naming an object in the room does is it's not distracting you from what's necessarily happening in the room, but what you're doing is you're actually making your brain think about something. And when it needs to think, you're moving from the emotional part of the brain to the thinking brain, and what that does is that switches on your prefrontal cortex. So all of a sudden, once you finish naming those 3 things, right, you then return to the situation that you're dealing with and you go, and you start to see it in a different light. And instead of letting that, and I say, everyone's got that inner dragon in them that, when they're feeling the threat that they let out, it's about controlling that inner dragon. And what that does, and that naming actually provides that stimulus. And it doesn't have to be a colour, it can be a letter. So if you said C, it could be computer, cupboard, clock. And just 3 things can actually switch that on. You can do more. There's one where you can apply the senses, where 5 things you see, 4 things you can hear, etc. But I find just naming things, some people don't have the time to actually go through that and they get confused with the amount of things they've got to do. So it's about really keeping it simple and going, how can I re-switch on my thinking brain in this moment? So... And that's the thing, like emotion. Yeah, so emotional regulation isn't necessarily about being calm all the time, because that's impossible. It's about control. And you can be passionate about what you're doing and care about what you're doing without being reactive.
Just grounding this into a classroom for a teacher who's listening, if this is the case, do you do this so that students can hear, they can see the teacher's pause, so the teacher goes, calendar, clock, compass, and the kid, what? And then or is it something you do quietly to yourself?
I will always leave this to teacher discretion. So I typically used to do it to myself in my head, but I would explain after the situation to the young person that I was working with or the group that I was with exactly what I was actually doing. So I would be like, look, and there's a strategy that we also use where you can name it, normalise it, and then now what? And a part of that strategy is actually naming it and normalising the emotion. And what that does is naming it actually reduces, or it identifies the emotion and activates that prefrontal cortex again. So you're actually going, okay, I'm thinking about what I'm feeling. And then normalising it recognises that the emotion is human, and it reduces shame and builds empathy. So what I would typically do is, in the moment, I would use that strategy of the 2 breaths and then name 3 things. I would do that within my own head. I would address the situation, and as I was addressing the situation, I would explain how it made me feel. So I would go, I'm using an I statement, so it's not you made me feel frustrated, because then that's putting a threat to the person that you're working with. So they're going to get their back arts up and they're going to come back at you kind of like, well, no, I was doing this and so on. So you always use an I statement, which is less threatening, and it's about you, not about them. So I'd always start with, I felt frustrated because I could see you weren't listening and you were playing with the pencils and the materials at your desk instead of focusing on the board. And then I would normalise it and go, I think that's pretty normal to feel frustrated when I'm trying to help you understand something and you're not showing a lot of respect. So what that does is that's how you can actually explain to them, and then how you were self-regulating. So I would then go and say, did you see how I paused and took a moment? That was me actually switching from my emotional state, because I'm not angry, I'm frustrated, because I want you to understand this so that you won't have as many questions later. So, and then we can go to the now what, and so now what can I do to help you to make sure that we're listening and being focused and able to take the information? Or now what do you need to be able to do this? So what we're doing is we're trying to create this supportive and safe environment where we're becoming emotionally literate. And we're explaining, and what that does is that helps the young person to actually build empathy as well, because they're seeing how it actually affects you also.
Still juggling forms the old-fashioned way? Say hello to Student Forms by Zuno. You can create, collect, and manage all your student forms online in one simple, secure platform. Save time, stay organised, and quick access everything you need, anytime. Visit zuno.com.au and see how Student Forms by Zuno can work for your school.
I'm getting the impression that, I love that term, emotionally literate, because I would imagine, especially with my background, Anglo-Saxon background, emotions are sort of kept invisible, like ghosts in the background, and suddenly, oh, this is happening. Whereas what you're doing is, if we imagine a puppeteer, you're teaching us to see the strings and understand what is pulling us in a certain direction, in my understanding of what you just said. Does that ring true for you?
What we all have is we all have these, a common term is an emotional backpack. That we're all carrying all this information with and experiences, and that's essentially what's going to shape the behaviours and the way that we interact in the world. And a part of, especially and with the way that the world is going now, the role of a teacher is starting to shift, in that content knowledge is not necessarily something that is the teacher is the holder of all the content and the knowledge, and it's that chalk and talk kind of mentality where this is what's right, you write it down, you remember it. Content is so accessible now that what the role of the teacher, and this is just my opinion, is needing to move into is actually helping young people navigate the content and being able to actually become emotionally literate and know that, okay, what is driving this behaviour and what is my purpose? Because there is so much information that a lot of young people don't know what their identity is. And that is such an important part of that next phase, which is motivation. And part of why I've spent time building an actual student identity program, it's around that purpose of understanding what my motivation is and what am I good at. Because when we look at, if we go to like Erik Erikson's research, where he looked at the developmental stages and the social, and how social and emotional development are kind of inseparable from learning. When we look at, and what he did was he mapped the development of human life based around the ages and what their needs were. So when we look at, say, primary school students, there's this constant battle between industry and inferiority. So that's particularly between the ages of 6 and 12. That's just a rough estimate, but that's typically around that age group. And the core question that they're really asking themselves is, can I be good at things, and do I have something to offer? So what they're looking at is they're discovering what they're actually good at and what they can do in the world. And that comes down to that idea about growth mindset. So it's actually recognising, and why people talk about recognition of praise or progress, and having an attempt at things, and the effort is so much more important at that age, because that's what actually fuels their resilience and builds resilience. Because, like anyone, we're not going to be great at things when we first start them. So I use an analogy where I talk to people and go, there was once upon a time in your life where you couldn't tie your shoes. And they look at me like I'm stupid. But the fact is that was a hard task at one time, but we've done it every day for how many years? And all of a sudden, we've become really proficient at it. And I would say we're all pretty good at tying our shoes. So the thing is at that age, we're really trying to look at, praising the effort, and that's what students are really trying to do. And then there's this shift. So when they move from between the ages of 12 and 18, they kind of have this idea of what they're good at and what they can contribute. And now they move into this idea of who am I? And where do I belong? And this is one of the big things that we're seeing in schools at the moment, is students and young people don't know who they are or where they belong. And a part of that adolescence phase is looking at testing boundaries, exploring identity, finding purpose. And the real need of young people in that age between 12 to 18 is psychological and emotional safety to explore and question. And there's a lot of research out there, and there's been new studies done very recently where they identify that strength-based identity programs actually will boost that motivation. And because when there's a purpose, and when young people know that they are good at something, or they have a purpose towards what they're working towards, they are intrinsically motivated, and that's the real crux of where we look at motivation in the terms of emotional intelligence, because it's not about external rewards. It's about mastery and meaning. And people with high emotional intelligence typically see, when they have a setback as information rather than it being the proof of failure. So that's where the resilience builds into it. And young people that actually see that and understand that, a setback is not that I'm bad at this. It's actually teaching me or giving me data to actually use to improve for next time. That's where we're getting that resilience built in. And the students that are doing that are the ones that, are you're seeing their academic performance increase, because that's really what we're looking for. So, it's more, motivation is built on meaning more than, pressure to do something or time constraint.
It is intriguing you mentioned that, because in one of the very early episodes of Around the School Table, we had a deputy principal from up in the Northern Territory actually say he doesn't ask middle school kids, what do you want to be? He asks them, who do you want to be? And I think that ties into what you're talking about.
100%. So, look, that's the when you know the who, you find out the what. So, it's one of those ones where when you have that intrinsic motivation behind who you are, and what you value as a person, it correlates typically with more creativity, longer term performance, and also a higher sense of well-being and self-worth. So that was essentially, a part of what I've developed over the last probably 2 to 3 years is a program that I run with, or offer to schools and run with schools, called My Brand. And what that does is that actually starts off with using the character strengths that were kind of popularised by, once they called themselves the BIA Institute, but now I believe they've changed it to VIA, and people talk about them as VIA Institute, and they came up with 24 character strengths. And what that does is that's kind of backed in research, but there was ideas around that when people know their character strengths, they report a higher sense of meaning or meaningfulness around what they're doing, higher sense of self-awareness, and also the higher ability to solve problems. So what that does is, in a school context, we're seeing young people with higher motivation and engagement. We're seeing lower stress levels, lower anxiety and depressive symptoms. We're also seeing stronger social connections and also seeing an improved ability to self-regulate. And so what the My Brand program does is it actually starts off with stepping them through, in our first session, students identify their 3 top character strengths. And we've created a little performer or a checklist that goes through, and it'll identify their strengths from there. And then what we actually do is we then use those character strengths for them to actually create a brand for themselves. And what that brand does is that gives them ownership of who they are and what they're good at. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to actually develop that sense of identity. And when they've got that identity, and that can be through, business cards, logos, whatever they would like to showcase as who they are. And what we then do is we use the 5 stages of emotional intelligence to then help them develop how they can live their brand. And they live their brand by putting into action and what we call an impact event.
And didn't you just have a student who identified as humour was one of their core strengths and values? Because I do a bit of stand-up comedy, I must say. And this student, part of the outworking of this, because I'm sure some listeners are thinking, okay, we're going to be looking at straight-laced, curriculum-based subjects, but here you found a tangent into comedy, and they've strutted their stuff.
Exactly right. So yeah, this young fellow, and this was a part of our pilot program when we were testing and ironing out the kinks of what we were doing. And this young student, the typical class clown, not overly academically minded either. So if the listeners are there, they can probably picture the type of student that we're working with here. And they may even have one in their class at the moment. And so what we did was we did the character strengths test, and they went through, and 2 of their strengths was kindness and humour. And I sat down with this young person, and we kind of started brainstorming. And I said, well, how could you live this? How could you live your brand? And how could you include humour? How could you include kindness around what we're doing? And they thought for a bit, and they kind of hummed and hawed, and then they were like, oh, I'll tell jokes. And I said, okay. And then we kind of unpacked that a bit more and went, okay, so how is telling jokes going to impact others around you? And, because jokes can actually be hurtful at times. And we started planting the seed around and looking at stand-up comics. And it got to the point where he was like, oh, my event, I can put on an event, and I will put on a stand-up comedy show, and I'll do it at lunchtime. I'll stand up and I'll perform, and I'll do that 2 weeks in a row, so that way I can get better at what I'm doing. And I'm just sitting here going, yes, 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 because what he was doing was he was actually applying all these kind of, this intrinsic motivation, because he's starting to go, I can't just do one, I need to do 2, because the first one's probably not going to be as good. So I'm going to now try and do it a second time and perfect it. Oh. And so he stood up, he did, I think 2 Thursdays, I recall, it was a Thursday afternoon at lunch, stood up and did a 5 to 10 minute routine to the cohort at lunchtime as they ate. And I mean, the joy and the pride of this young person from doing that, because he actually identified his purpose. And he'd seen that this was something that he knew he was good at telling jokes and being funny because people would laugh in class. But now he had an actual reason to do it for good and to help people and have a context and an environment that was actually okay to do it in. So what happened was he realised he didn't have to now do it in class. So, and this was a part of our check-in and debrief afterwards, was he now found an outlet that he could actually use. So we talked about and unpacked, okay, so if this had this effect here, why is that different from the effect you get in class? And we started talking about the environment, and the environment is people are learning and they're focused on trying to, improve their understanding of what's being taught. And if that wasn't something he was passionate about, that's okay. But he can't focus on taking that opportunity away from others. So that started developing the empathy there. So he could see that what he was doing was not great. Yeah. But now he was still able to be himself in this new environment. And we led that into, and that discussion then led into, a profession. And, we talked about, comics don't make a lot of money, a lot of them, unless there's a small percentage that make it and become really famous. So we want you to be able to still pursue this passion and this love of what you're good at. But how can we make that viable long term? So when you do leave school, or even when you're in your senior years of school, you can still do this. And we spoke about, this transitioned into attending open mic events on weekends and working part-time so he can afford to kind of live a lifestyle, but then gets to do comedy on the side. And then hopefully one day he might get found to be a really good comedian and get better gigs and so on and so forth. So we started mapping out this action plan. And that led into, we've got a template that I use with students or with people that I coach. It's called our SOAR framework, and it's a part of using a visualization. We find out the motivation, and then we map this action plan into small mini milestones. And what that does is that gives motive, because if we look at a big goal, it can become very overwhelming. But when we actually map it to a smaller mini milestone that seems achievable, when we achieve that, it actually intrinsically creates momentum, and motivation leads from momentum. And when we build that momentum, we become more motivated. And if we have to wait a long period of time for anything to kind of happen, we lose that motivation. So all of a sudden, we've got this action plan for him to do these little things to build his repertoire. And all of a sudden, his mindset around everything changed because he actually knew a purpose. And that's exactly leading back to where that principle that you had in an earlier episode was talking about. It's, who do I want to be?
I do want to finish off with a few quick-fire questions, and it's unfair of me because these are quite deep, but I'd love you off the cuff on these. I've heard you quoted as saying, defiance isn't disrespect, it's a bid for independence. Can you give us your short burst on what you mean when you're saying that?
When someone says no to something, typically they are saying no because it's a search for them having some authority or independence. Now, what that means is it's not them being disrespectful, it's them trying to keep their identity as who they are and have some control over the situation. So a really easy way to kind of navigate that is providing a choice. And I use a really simple analogy here where most parents, if there are parents listening, you will have had a child at some point in your life and it's the morning routine of getting dressed. And they are adamant that, no, I'm not wearing that. No, this is what I'm wearing. And it becomes a nightmare because they're walking out dressed as a unicorn to go to a funeral. Now, not appropriate, right? But what you can do is by providing a choice, you give them, okay, today, would you like to choose your top or your bottoms? And what that does is that gives them that idea of, okay, I still have some skin in the game. I still can actually have some independence here. And they might go, okay, I'm going to choose a top. Okay, brilliant. I'm going to choose your bottoms. And then you can let them kind of choose the accessories to go with that. So it's about defiance is not necessarily, or saying no is not being defiant. It's more about maintaining their independence and providing that choice.
While you're here, it would be a shame for me not to ask for your take on this, the conversation in Australia around the social media ban for kids under 16. Do you have a hot take on that? Is this a helpful policy or is this a Band-Aid?
I have flipped and flopped on this, both sides. The intention around what they're doing is right, in that some form of regulation needs to happen to, I guess, protect young people from being exposed to things that they shouldn't be exposed to at that age because they can't comprehend what's happening. The problem with banning anything, and this is historically, when something is banned, it becomes a novelty and it becomes something that it's really a threat to an individual's independence. So when we're older and adults see things that are said as a no-go zone or, it's restricted, they can see that because their prefrontal cortex is switched on, they can see that as being able to control the risk or it's removing a problem and protecting everyone. Whereas for adolescents, it actually triggers the opposite because they're wired to seek that autonomy and social belonging. And when something is restricted, it doesn't stop the drive. It redirects it, I guess, to underground or sneaky kind of alternatives. So what happens, like psychologically, is it increases their curiosity around something that's prohibited and it draws attention to it. They're going to be more secretive and they're going to try and find workarounds to restore, their sense of control. And, things like VPNs, hidden accounts, alternative platforms. So you're going to see platforms like Discord now starting to kind of share more information or screen grabs, and it's going to become less of influencers and copying what they're doing and more of we're going to start taking the risk-taking behaviour and start sharing that.
Okay.
Because that's that rebellion and the behaviour, starts moving from exploring to resistance and breaking the rules becomes that symbol of identity. So really the idea of the ban is, and I liken it to when before internet, we got all of our information and social cues from, 90s, 80s sitcoms, which were highly regulated. They were classified and put on at certain times based on the viewership. Whereas now we live in a world where everything and anything is accessible at the drop of a hat. So that and we have social media influencers and content being posted that is not regulated. So a lot of the kind of, I guess, the onus is more around not banning social media, but these companies that Instagrams, TikTok, all of that, their algorithms are so powerful. The conversation should be around, okay, let's tailor the algorithms that what we are showing to people rather than completely banning it. And that's the same. So like YouTube have now YouTube Kids, which the algorithm shows content appropriate for that age. Mm. So it's once we make something taboo, it puts it on a pedestal. The problem is deeper than just banning and banning. The idea behind it. The idea behind it is completely acceptable, but history tells us it's probably not going to fix it, and it's probably going to exacerbate.
Yeah, I might even call it a Band-Aid. Anyway.
Very nice. I do like that, and I am such a fan of a pun, so I am now going to steal that seed.
Last question. You have a motto, which I love, be more impressive in person than online. Can you just take us out with a short summary as to the motivation behind that and its application?
Yeah, so when I work with any young person or even adults, to be honest, it's about you want to be more impressive in person than on your profile. And what that means is it's essentially at some point in your life, you are going to meet someone in person. It doesn't matter how hard you try. And if your presentation on your social media profile whatever it is that you're displaying your content on is highly filtered, highly regulated. It's taken, 100 photos to get the perfect angle. When you meet someone in person, you don't have that at your disposal. And what you need to do is the way that you actually build respect and credibility and have people kind of gravitate towards you is how you act in that kind of human state. And that is really powerful. And that's where you build connection and you build trust with people. Because if they're seeing one thing on your profile or your social media, that's all well and good. And if you get likes, that's fine. But if they're seeing something different in real life, they're not going to trust now what they see online. So you've lost out on both sides. Yeah. So it's all about, you want to leave conversations or leave interactions with people going, I've made their life better. And that's the way that we kind of frame things. And if you can do that, you're going well on your way to living this world as a great person. And that comes down to, those 5 domains within emotional intelligence. And if you can start nailing that, you're going to be a great person and you're going to live with and be impactful in what you do in this world.
On that note, and I might say, a podcast dwells halfway between in real life and online. So I'm hoping that both Dylan and I will titillate you a little bit more if we ever meet face to face. Until that happens, Dylan Sulzer, thank you very much for joining me around the school table.
Not a drama, Steve. Absolute pleasure, and look forward to having a chat again.